It would be an understatement to say that I am an absolutely huge fan of Jonathan Rauch. It's the 20th anniversary of his book, Kindly Inquisitors. Kindly Inquisitors, I really do put up there with On Liberty as among my favorite defenses of freedom of speech that I've ever read. It is concise, it is beautiful, it is elegant, and it is a moral defense. It's not a merely legalistic defense of why free speech matters. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of context, Jonathan would talk about how we've turned into a society where there's an offendedness sweepstakes. And just this past month, the University of Edinburgh and 5 other universities in the United Kingdom banned the song Blurred Lines because they thought it was offensive to women. The university that gave us David Hume is banning a Robin Thicke song. And Jonathan Rauch saw this coming. Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's an editor for Atlantic.com. He's written on everything from gay marriage to how to take care of your introvert. I'm a huge fan, and on that I'll hand off to John.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for the great work that you do at FIRE. I'm John Tierney. I'm a science columnist for the New York Times, the author of Willpower, and a huge fan also of Jonathan's book. This is something that it's not that often that a journalist writes a book that 20 years later is even better than it was then. It is such a wonderful defense of free speech. And what's wonderful about it also is that you take seriously the objections to people who say that they're to offensive speech. And you talk about the different defenses there are for why we should limit certain kinds of speech. And you make a great explanation. As a science columnist, I was really intrigued by this, about liberal science being one of the 3 things that Adam Smith's invisible hand gave us. There's liberal democracy, there's the capitalist system, and liberal science. Do you want to just start by explaining what liberal science is?
I would love to. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take a moment of personal privilege and thanks to thank Fire and Reason for this wonderful event. I've never spoken at the Museum of Sex before. I have to say, when someone hands you this at the Museum of Sex, you do wonder where it's been, but it's and thank you all especially for coming tonight. But without the support of Greg and Matt, this revised edition, the expanded edition of Kindly Inquisitors, would not have happened. It very literally happened at the suggestion of a FIRE staff member who said, you know, that book's 20 years old and we love it and you really should bring it up to date and bring it out as an ebook, and that's what set all of this off. So I owe all of you a lot of thanks. Mm-hmm. So liberal science, this was born out of frustration during the Salman Rushdie affair of the late 80s, which you're old enough to remember. And to the extent anyone was able to defend freedom of thought at all, it was legalistic. It was First Amendment. It is what does the Constitution say, without understanding what we were actually trying to do here. I had a background at Yale in history of science, and believed, and based on work I'd done and that others had done, that science is the third and actually the greatest of our liberal social systems. The great problem in society is how you deal with conflict. If it's conflict over resources, you use markets, and what it is that the token that you use is exchange of goods, of commodities, of services. In politics, you're allocating power, and the mechanism you use is exchange of compromise and votes. Well, in intellectual life, the question is who is right, who has the truth? And you deal with that through exchange of criticism. Everyone gets to talk, everyone gets to put hypotheses out there, all get criticized. There's no end to this game. It is, like all liberal systems, it's an open-ended, depersonalized, rule-based system. And at the end of the day, whichever hypotheses are still standing is our knowledge, always subject to further change. It depends on criticism. In fact, it vitally depends on offending people. That's the foundation of it. But a lot of people had forgotten that, and they thought it's all supposed to be people in white lab coats being nice to each other. Well, that's not really where knowledge comes from.
And it's not the experimental method that sets science apart. It's the social method, this method of finding truth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is the great insight of a philosopher named Charles Sanders Peirce. Has anyone heard of him? Greatest of all American philosophers. A few people have? Wow.
He often came to the Museum of Sex, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure he did. Though he died in, 1910?
He was early.
They were kinky in those days. You know what they said about the Victorians and the piano legs?
Yes.
Yeah, so he was You shouldn't interview me here. It's not safe.
Feel free to offend anyone here, though.
He was way ahead of his time, but he was the first to understand that the difference ultimately between the scientific enterprise writ large, that includes not just hard science, but the humanities. It includes journalism. It's historians. It's everybody trying to find truth. Is not that you're performing an experiment, because you can do that alone. What he pointed out is that if you've got a person working in the privacy of his own room, never talking to anyone, there's absolutely no way to tell the difference, even in principle, between Einstein and the genius. Between Einstein and a fool, Einstein and a raving lunatic. You know, they're both scribbling equations on the board and stuff. The key test is, do you then subject those ideas to repeatable public experiments and public criticism, such that anyone can have at them? That's how you know the difference between Einstein and the madman. It's a social system for making knowledge, and it turns out to be fantastically good at two things. One is finding the needles in the haystack, those bits of knowledge in the vast amounts of dross that come out every day. Most of what most people hypothesize is wrong. Second, it's very good at keeping the peace, because by definition, no one can be in charge of it. Mm-hmm. It's a public criticism system, and it's a rolling public consensus. Mm-hmm. So you don't get the creed wars, and you don't get the radical disruptions that you do in authoritarian systems of knowledge construction.
And there are two laws to it, you say, right?
Yeah, yeah. No final say, no special authority. I've seen you've read the book.
Yeah.
But have you bought the book?
Yeah, I mean, I have to ask you about the foreword where George Will just said he stands on the shoulders of you. So he really, and all of us do. But he said...
You all stand on the shoulders of me?
Yes, exactly. And it's heavy. I know it's very heavy.
Okay, we're in the Museum of Sex, you know.
Now, he said your one fault with the book was that you make a mistake that temperate people make, that they assume that that the enemies of free speech are as moderate and rational as they are, and he thought kindly was maybe too kind.
Yeah, he thought I'm giving the other side, so to speak, too much credit, which was an interesting comment. So that would the way to talk about that would be to talk about who the opponents of this system are. Mm-hmm. And that's, the book is divided into two halves. For those of you who have never actually read Kindly Inquisitors in the original edition, the first half is about liberal science and how it works. Liberal science, our knowledge-producing system. And these two rules, no final say, no special authority, which are the rules of all liberal systems. Voting, markets. The point is, it doesn't matter who you are, no special authority. Everyone basically follows the same rules. You get one vote each. You follow pricing signals. You subject yourself to criticism, and no final say. The system never comes to a final result. There's no outside platform from which to say, this is the right answer, you have to reach this answer. So there's no monarch, there's no final fixed distribution of goods or prices, and there's no final knowledge. So it's a liberal system, open-ended, rules-based. So who does not like that? Well, there are some people who don't like it because they're Hitler. Or because they're the KKK. Mm. But I would argue those people are not most people who don't like it. Most people who don't like it are uncomfortable with it for reasons that actually speak well of them. They think that the results of the system are not fair. For example, if you're an Afrocentrist, you're going to say, this science has excluded my people's history, for example. I think that's wrong, but they're well motivated. But more important, the great challenge to liberal science, and the one that I think has emerged as important over the last 20 years since the book was first written, is what I call the humanitarian challenge. I say there are two, egalitarian and humanitarian. Egalitarians say we have a platform of fairness from outside the system. These results aren't fair, so let's change the results. So, let's go in the schools and teach creationism. That hasn't done so well. The other is the humanitarian challenge. And those are people who are saying, look, this system allows people to get hurt. In fact, it often makes a point of hurting people because it is criticizing people. And sometimes it allows people to behave in hateful ways. If you're gay, you know all about what it's like to live in a society that is full of anti-gay speech, anti-gay thought. Why would we allow that? Why would we allow, for example, racist rhetoric? This is hurtful, it's discriminatory. The big change in the last 20 years is a much more sophisticated version of this, which is it's a hostile environment doctrine. It says
Version 2.0, you
yeah,
call
version
it, right?
2.0. I wrote this afterward to this electronic edition that says what's happened in the last 20 years. And it says that the big thing that's happened is it used to just be, well, Greg Lukianoff offended me, and that hurt my feelings, and I'm a minority because I'm gay. You're a homophobe. We need to discipline you and throw you out of this school or re-educate you. It's a good thing they're not really saying that as much anymore. They're now saying, look, it's an objective standard. It's not, did Greg hurt my feelings? It's is what he and other people say and create an environment, a social environment that's hostile to me as a minority, such that I can't participate equally in society. So that's a new, I would argue, and different kind of challenge. And that's where what I try to take on in the afterward. Where I might disagree with George Will is I see these people as well-motivated, misguided, but well-motivated. And I think in order to effectively counter them, I think we need to assume that too.
Right. Well, I mean, it's very nicely done in the book, the way you really give the other side's argument and you don't just flip it aside. And you make a great argument in the afterword, using this against this humanitarian idea, the idea that there's such a hostile environment that we have to step in. And I'll let you explain it more, but one of the great insights I thought that you had there was that by the time someone is willing to give a speech code, either a law or a speech code on campus, is willing to give you special protection in a speech code or a law, you don't really need it anymore because you've already got enough political power. And you tell a great example of what's happened to gays over the last 50 years. So why don't you tell that?
Well, that's the story. You want to hear the story?
Yeah.
So I decided when I wrote the afterword to this book that I would try to take on the very best, narrowest, most intellectually solid and emotionally appealing case that the opponents of unrestricted thought and speech and debate could make. And to do that, I looked to a man named Jeremy Waldron, who's written an excellent book that I can recommend called The Harm in Hate Speech, which is a very, well, I should say, comparatively narrow doctrine of hostile environment. And it says, so imagine, as a thought experiment, that you're in a society, you're a member of a historically vulnerable minority group, and you're in a society that is, it's not just occasionally some bum like Greg Lukianoff saying offensive things, that we all have to live with, that's free speech. No, it's a society that is literally festooned, saturated with hateful ideas and diminutions of minorities. And there have been such instances. The blacks face that in America for a very, very long time. And I said, well, in that instance, they're saying, well, surely in that case we can regulate for the benefit of minorities so that they don't have to live as second-class citizens. So I said, all right, that's a really tough one. That's the extreme case. I said to myself, well, what examples of that can I think of? And I very quickly realized that I grew up in one. I was born in 1960. You guys can do the math. The hairline says it all. And I'm gay. And in the world I grew up in, until really quite recently, the list is endless. Couldn't serve in the military. Every form of government discrimination, every form of private discrimination, fired from our jobs, arrested by the police. But more than that, it was a given in that society. It was saturated with anti-gay sentiment, with bigotry, with the assumption that we were sick, that we were evil, that we were a threat to kids, we were a threat to social stability, we were gross, we were sinful. Everywhere you looked, it was built in. It was part of the background assumption of the society in those days. And then I thought, well, so is there an argument for a hate speech law in a society like that? But the question answers itself when you ask yourself in 1968, 1955, 1953, did you all know this? A U.S. senator shot himself in his office because J. Edgar Hoover was threatening to out his son as gay. as part of a deliberate political plot by Hoover and others to get this guy out of the way. I mean, this was going on in America. So it was really bad. And I said, well, you know, you're not going to get a hate crimes law passed to protect gay people in that environment. In fact, you'll get a hate crimes law that represses gay people because our speech will be hateful and a threat to children. It's going to be protect children from this harmful speech. You don't get hate crimes laws protection. In fact, you don't even get to make the case for them until after society has turned that corner and is willing to hear your case. So then I began asking myself, okay, so if hate crimes laws are the cart, what is the horse? What drove this change? And that's a lot of what the afterword is about. A lot of it is about an incredible man named Frank Kameny. Some of you might know him. I see a few heads nodding. Does anyone know the name Frank Kameny? Oh, well, can we get to that at some point?
No,
I can
please,
tell the story.
it's a great story. Please tell the story about
All
that.
right, well, I'll finish the big point and then come back to the small point. The big point is the reason we were able to make the progress we were against hate is that hate of this kind is not usually motivated by people who want to hurt other people. It's not, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. It's people with wrong ideas, orthodoxies that are stale, that are discriminatory, but they believe these falsehoods. They believe that Jews control the international financial system. They believe that blacks are inferior and can't, and are a threat to, you know, white women. They believe that gays undermine the social order and try to seduce children. Well, if someone thinks I'm a threat to their children or family, they will hate me. The way we went after that was by exposing the wrongness of their ideas, by showing that we were not dangerous or a threat. And the way we did that was by using to the hilt the system of public criticism we call liberal science. And sure enough, when exposed to criticism, these anti-gay views, they crumbled. They were indefensible. There was never any evidence for them. There was never any coherence to them. That's the mechanism by which we triumph. So I'm arguing in the afterword that in some indirect sense, hate speech is minorities' friends. It makes us push back, and in a climate that allows hate speech also allows us to answer the hate speech, and we will win over time. So how did we win? The story of Frank Kameny?
Sure.
So when I tell this story, I get emotional. I knew this guy, and it's hard to tell without, but I'm fine. I just love to tell the story anyway. Okay. So Frank Kameny, born in 1925, serves in the U.S. Army in the front lines in Italy during World War II, serves valiantly, goes on to get a PhD, becomes a scientist, an astronomer by training, goes to work for the U.S. Army Map Service. 1957 is caught in a police sting, and I think Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. And the police, of course, were in the business in those days of harassing gay people. And was fired from his government job as a result because he had an arrest record and he was queer, he was gay. In those days, if you were gay, you could not work for the U.S. government. Most people in that situation in the 50s understandably crawled away. Some of them killed themselves. Frank Kameny was different. Frank Kameny fought back. He appealed to the U.S. Civil Service Commission, as it was then called. It's now called the Office of Personnel Management, a point we'll come back to. They wouldn't even hear the case. They simply said, this is the rule. He then went to Congress. He wrote letters. He got letters back from members of Congress saying things like, in all my years in this House of Representatives, yours is the most disgusting letter I have ever received. He then argued a case, took the case himself, acting as his own lawyer to the U.S. Supreme Court. They, of course, did not grant cert, but he wrote what's now a classic brief. Frank was a liberal in the old school. He believes that the Declaration of Independence was a promise that had been personally made to him, and that what had happened to him was a betrayal of that promise. And he said so. In the brief to the Supreme Court, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I went to Europe to fight tyranny overseas only to come home and discover that I must now fight the tyranny of my own government against me. Supreme Court did not hear his case. So he then begins representing other gay people who've been fired from their jobs because he's willing to do it and he knows the rules. He loses those. One of those is an employee of the member of Library of Congress. They were firing people. 1965, he leads the first gay civil rights protest. Picketers in front of the White House and picketers in Independence Hall. In 1971, he's the first openly gay candidate for Congress. He forms the Mattachine Society of Washington, the first homophile group. In 1972, he manages to seize the microphone at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in Washington, D.C., and tells the assembled psychiatric establishment to its face that they are committing a campaign of extermination against homosexuals. That's how he puts it. This is Kameny crusaded for 30 years to repeal the sodomy law in the District of Columbia. He did all of this and more. So then the gay marriage movement comes along, and he's too libertarian to be all that interested in marriage, and he and he kind of fades from sight. But all those things he did cumulatively made a difference. Again and again, one of the things that proponents of hate speech law say is that hate speech silences minorities. Well, it silences a lot of members of minorities, but others it forces forward. You get your Frank Kamenys, and the great thing about liberal science is you don't need that many Galileos or Kings or Kamenys. What it's great at doing is surfacing these ideas, testing them, and if they're better ideas, and Kamenys were better ideas, bringing them to the center of the debate. So the end of the story, and the part where I always choke up, is that Kameny lives to see the following things happen. He died in 2011, but by that point, in 2007, his papers, including a letter from the Library of Congress denying the appeal of the fired Library of Congress employee, his papers are accepted into the civil rights collection of the Library of Congress. So that's fun. His original picket signs, which survived in his attic, joined the Smithsonian Civil Rights Collection and are displayed next to Jefferson's writing desk. He lives to see this. Gives a little speech. It was really fun. In 2009, he receives the pen from Obama when Obama signs some federal benefits, partner benefits for civil servants. In 2011, he's in the front row to watch the signing of the bill overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But my favorite bit is that I think it's 2010, he is given a special ceremony in which the Office of Personnel Management, which is the successor, it's the same agency that fired him, was the Civil Service Commission, gives Kameny a public apology for his firing. They give him their highest award, which is the Theodore Roosevelt Prize. And my favorite detail is that the director of the Office of Office of Personnel Management, who gives him this prize, is, you can see this coming, right? Openly gay. Kameny, yeah, I mean, what can you say in the face of that kind of courage? Kameny, by the way, at this ceremony, responds typical Frank way. He says, he sort of rises from a chair and says, "Apology accepted." So this is the power of speech, of thought. He didn't have money. He didn't have votes. He didn't have anything. He had the power of ideas.
Now, what I love about the book, I mean, that's a great story you tell, and then you follow that immediately by noting, and it's a caution you have throughout the book, that there's a little bit of the fundamentalist in all of us, and you raise the question now that gay rights groups have basically won the public battle at this point. I mean, in so many ways, that they're becoming intolerant in some ways. And you raise, a couple of examples. For instance, when someone put an app on Apple that promised to cure homosexuality in 60 days through Jesus, and I guess it doesn't work, right?
I have to tell you, I haven't tried it.
But there was an
I'm
outcry.
a Jew. Maybe I should try it. Wait, maybe.
But there was an outcry about this from gay rights groups, and Apple then, removed the app. And you you're very fair, even-handed. Was that the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think we need to be really careful. This is not a book one of the things that distinguishes my book, I think, from most of what's out there, is it's not about law. It's not about what the Constitution lets you do. It's about what's wise to do. And I think that we gay people, now that we have the majority of the culture on our side, need to be very careful about remembering that the reason what we were about in the gay rights movement was not rights for gay people to be ourselves, to be true to our conscience. It's rights of everyone to be themselves and true to their conscience. And in some cases, that's going to mean letting foolish, bigoted people or Christians with terrible ideas, often hateful ideas, ideas that are bad for young gay kids. But it's going to mean letting them do their thing. Of course, groups have a right to protest an iPhone app, and Apple has a right to withdraw it. I'm just saying, I'm not sure that's the smart thing to do. You know, there's this movie opening November 1st, Ender's Game. Has anyone heard about this? Have you heard about there's a boycott movement? Some gay folks put up a website. So Orson Scott Card, who wrote the book on which the movie is based, has said anti-gay things, some of which are pretty terrible. And you know, not good stuff. And so some people want to boycott it. And I don't think that's a smart approach for a lot of tactical reasons. You know, it's not going to hurt Scott Card, it's going to hurt the people who worked on the movie, many of whom are gay. But also for the moral reason that we need to remember we got where we are because we were able to go mano a mano with Jerry Falwell, Anita Bryant. Orson Scott Card does us a favor by putting those views out there and giving us a platform to rebut them and giving us an adversary by comparison of whom we look better. So it won't help us, I think, to try to suppress these views. I think it will hurt us. And the long-term result actually is to bring more fame and attention to these marginal characters who are spouting this nonsense.
That's a good point. You talk about in fundamentalists that there are all kinds of fundamentalists, and that it's easy enough to say that we shouldn't be pushing creationism in science classes, and we should be careful about these Bible thumping. But that the really greater threat today is really more from left-wing fundamentalists now.
Yeah, what I had in mind there is, I use fundamentalist I hijacked the term and use it for my own sinister purposes, which are to, I say that a fundamentalist is anyone who cannot take seriously the possibility that he might be wrong. No matter how many times he's been wrong in the past, this time he is absolutely for sure right. If you're absolutely for sure right, there's no point in liberal science because all it's doing is allowing people who are wrong to pollute the environment with stupid, wrong-headed views, usually evil views. And yeah, in America, we've seen a lot more of that traditionally on the right. So why did I say these days I'm more worried about the left? It's because the environment where we're seeing more of this happen, for reasons both cultural and historical, tends to be academia. And it tends to be driven by this view that minorities need protection from discriminatory verbal harassment. This is something, I think there's a group in Philadelphia that knows something about this and has been known to work on it. And I think they'll tell you they're getting more of this energy from the left than the right. Would that be fair to say? That's fair to say. And the reason for that isn't that left-wing people are bad and right-wing people are good. It's that they've got this genuine view that minorities have been hurt and oppressed in American society, which, by the way, is true. And they're trying to create a campus culture that is friendly to minorities. And if you're sure you're right, and if you don't want people to get hurt, then it's only natural to say, well, we're just going to have rules and say you can't hurt people by saying hateful things here or by engaging in discriminatory conduct, which you then define to include speech, which is a form of discriminatory behavior. And then once you do that, you've got the whole apparatus of, kind of speech inquisitions and disciplinary codes, and people get worried about having an open classroom conversation about whether homosexuality is morally acceptable, for example. So yeah, these days I think there's more problems on the left, but it will change. Mm-hmm. One thing I would love to get out of people to get out of Kindly Inquisitors is this is not left-right. Mm-hmm. This is as long as we have liberal science, an open-ended public process for finding knowledge, a lot of people will be unhappy with it, just as they are with markets, because it's unstable. On any given day, anyone can say anything, but it's also discriminatory. Big point of the book is liberal science is very cruel to you if you're wrong. It doesn't put you in jail, but it marginalizes you. If you're a creationist in America today, you cannot get the time of day in any biology course in any college in the country. You're just like, you're a loser. Well, that doesn't seem fair if you're a creationist. The way liberal science works is it rewards with prestige and attention people whose views stand up to repeated critical checking. But that is not nice if your views do not stand up to repeated critical checking. So you're always going to get this humanitarian complaint, well, what about poor Greg over here? I'm sorry to pick on you. You're designated straight man for tonight. But this guy's being marginalized. He's not getting equal time in the classroom. There may be millions of people who believe the things he believes, yet he's not. He's being pushed to the margins. That doesn't seem fair to people. And that's going to be a tension in liberal science forever, as will be the tension that this is criticism, it is hurtful. If you know anything, if you've looked at the literature on the sociology of science, you know that we imagine scientists are boring people in white lab coats with petri dishes. In fact, as the great historian and sociologist of science David Hull once wrote, in science, academic science, one of the greatest of all motivators is, I am going to get that son of a bitch. I mean, this is hand-to-hand combat, politely veiled. So it's not, liberal science is not nice.
And I will get prestige by overturning the idea of the last generation, so that there's that constant
you'll get
tension.
Prestige by overturning the idea of my book. So have at
Well,
it.
that's coming right now, actually.
Write a New York Times column about the wrongness of my book.
You do have a caution about, in talking about the fundamentalists in all of us, you say that you've seen it in sort of libertarian free market people. Now, this was the one idea that I thought should have been cut from your book.
Yeah, my friends.
I'm reluctant to even talk about it tonight, but I'm going to give you a chance.
Yeah, well, the publishers of this book, who I should acknowledge also with immense gratitude, are the Cato Institute and the University of Chicago Press, who co-published this. And back 20 years ago, when this book was published, one thing that impressed me about Cato is I do have a section about people I'd encountered in Washington back in the 80s who I regarded as fundamentalists on economic issues. There was no amount of evidence that could conceivably convince them that any tax increase could ever be good for the economy, which strikes me as an empirical question, and thus struck me as a dogmatic attitude. But the point I was making was to say even people who pride themselves on being open to coin a phrase, reason, if we're not careful, we fall into dogmatism, and the safeguard against that is not in ourselves. Humans become dogmatic. We think we know the truth. The safeguard in that is in being forced or pushed by the conventions of liberal science that if we want respect for our opinions, we have to expose them to criticism of others. We've got to put them out there and potentially be judged wrong. So the point I was making is that even the friendliest toward reason must and should submit their views to checking, and will do best in an atmosphere where everything is subject to checking.
Well, in that spirit, I think it's time to put your ideas to public checking here.
Hi. In terms of free speech, when you're talking about boycotting a film, isn't boycotting free markets in play in free speech? They're not trying to ban it. They're boycotting it. Isn't that a valid response to free speech?
Yes, it's constitutionally protected. It's an age-old gesture of protest. I'm suggesting it's not necessarily wise. If what you're saying out in front of the theater is, we disagree with this, or we think this is bigoted, or here's another point of view handing out pamphlets, that is probably better than what boycotters often ask for, which is to have the thing withdrawn, to say, take it away from us. Now, they're entitled to use their market power and their voices to say, make this go away, or silence this person. Or in the case of Orson Scott Card, they were doing a tertiary boycott, because they were trying to punish anyone associated with this movie, regardless of their views. And I'm saying, yes, it's protected, it's an age-old tactic. For people in the position of gays today, it's not a very wise tactic. What the anti-gay right is doing now is receding to a second line of defense, having mostly lost the argument in the culture about the wrongness of homosexuality per se. They're now saying, well, gay people are the new bullies, the new civil rights violators. They are violating our religious liberty, and they're forcing everyone to agree with them on pain of like being fired from your job or being otherwise harassed and pressured. And I think it's unwise for us to feed into that narrative. I think the narrative we should be feeding is we fought for the open society so that even complete jerks can participate in it. And we will, this is the spirit of Frank Kameny. Frank was, for 50 years he was active. He was extremely confrontational. I once heard him at an event like this go face-to-face with a person on the Family Research Council and tell him to his face, if you think your God believes these things about gay people, I can't do this with the mic because that's how he sounded. If you think that, then your God is a false and bigoted God. I mean, that's the way he talked. So he was no shrinking violet. But in all the years of his doing that, he never called for anyone else to be silenced. He called for himself to be heard.
What is that impulse that comes over a group once it, passes a threshold? We see this in all kinds of oppressed groups where they do start bullying, that they've got that political power and they start doing the kind of thing that was done to them. I mean, do you see that as, and I wonder, is it too kind to call that a humanitarian impulse? It's really more of, I've got power and I'm going to exercise it now.
Well, George Will might say it's a power play, and in some cases it is. I think some of what goes on in campuses is people exerting power over other people. But to go back to something I alluded to earlier, I think if you're going to pull up bad ideas by the roots, you have to deal with the people who have the bad ideas for all the best reasons. You can't just say you're a bad person. And there are a lot of good reasons for people to behave this way, and I'll give you one. So if you are a gay teenager in America and you are being told that you can be changed and that there's something wrong with you, you may not be in an environment that is all that permeable to liberal science and public criticism. And this stuff can be very damaging to gay young people. So the impulse to protect people, especially kids, from these messages is strong, and it's founded in something very primordially protective. Waldron's best example, in his book that really makes you think about hate speech is, what if you're a member of a minority in a country that has a big nativist movement that's saying, people like you get out, and your kids who are 8, 10 years old have to walk past those posters to school every day. How are you going to feel about that? Should that be allowed? Should that be done to your kids? So the impulses here are both bad and good. There's some of the offendedness sweepstakes, but there's also some genuine humanitarian protective impulse, and you've got to deal with both.
John, I'd like to introduce a new topic that may or may not be in your revised Kindly Inquisitors, but it's one that you've researched.
You could find out by buying it.
You betcha, and I will. And as of about 15 minutes ago, I committed myself to doing that. You have researched and written very thoughtfully on this topic, and that is the income gap, which I think is rapidly becoming perhaps one of the most powerful, important issues of the day. Even if one doesn't, quote, believe in it, from a perceptual standpoint, it remains extremely important. And I'd like you to offer a perspective on your perspective on the libertarian view of the income gap debate, which I'm assuming you're familiar with the arguments that libertarians make about it.
But you will forgive me if I say we should have that discussion afterwards.
Sure.
I've been thinking and writing about that a lot, and I think that conservatives have got to do a lot better on what's going on with income equality than they're doing. Because I think 2012 was the last the last presidential election for a long time in which this won't be a major issue. But I'd rather talk about that in some other context, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
I'm intrigued by your discussion of what's happened in the last 20 years. One observation I have is my son is in 5th grade at a, let's just say, unnamed hoity-toity school here in New York. And the sort of coat of arms of the school at the lower school that they walk by in the hallways on multiple occasions a day has a list of sort of credos to live by. And I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but they are redundant, and they go something like, be kind, be considerate, listen. I don't think don't offend is one of them, but spiritually that's in there. And the overall ethos of even very lower school education, in my observation, is very much geared to not offending, not, God forbid, bullying. I'm on the board of FIRE, and so Greg and I have discussed numerous occasions whether this is permeating down from, the university level to the point where, people get inculcated in this new ethos at a very young age, and so by the time they get to college, even if they know their, quote, rights, they're just not going to be inclined to exercise them. And so I wonder, A, if you observe that at all, and B, what is someone to do? I have trouble, I guess, debating with the head of school and arguing against kindness or for bullying. And when the kids come home, I like kindness and I like respectful kids. So how do you sort of undermine the unstated assumptions of a lot of this cultural stuff that's permeating even to a very, very low age? Sorry to drone on.
No, it's a very deep question, and it's hard to put my view on this across in a bumper sticker for many of the same reasons that it's always hard to defend liberal systems in which individuals get hurt. What about poor people in a capitalist economy? So this may come as a shock to some of you, but I'm actually pro-kindness. And I am not for offending people gratuitously. I think it's rude. And actually, a lot of what, interpreted one way, a lot of what the poster in your, is it son or daughter's? Son's school said is very old-fashioned, which is mind your manners. I am a big believer in good manners and in a right and wrong way to treat people. But what I tell people is you want people to try to behave in a kind and considerate fashion toward each other, and you want to inculcate that, but you also want people to understand that that does not give them a right never to be offended at what other people say, that there's a right and a responsibility, and that the responsibility is to be thick-skinned. So what I would like that school to also say is try to be kind to people, but also you have an obligation to hear things that sometimes you won't like. So it's a two-way street. The other way I try to come at this, also not the easiest thing to explain, is that there's a difference between what you want the individual to do and what you want the system to do. You want the individual to be kind. You don't want the system to be kind. You want the system to be neutral. You want the system to tolerate a certain degree of unkindness. How do you police the unkindness? Well, it turns out people who go out of their way to be offensive from day to day, we have a scientific term for those. It's jerk. There are other terms which would be at home here in the Museum of Sex. And those people self-marginalize pretty quickly. Society, polite societies call that for a reason, right? It's very good at pushing these people off to the side. So I am all for schools saying, mind your manners. I kind of like the old gentleman's code that colleges used to have in the old days. It was a very different environment then, but the rule was, look, don't behave like a jerk, and if you behave like a jerk, we might kick you out, or you might get punched in the nose, and that's too bad for you. So But it's hard to put that across, right? Because when kindness actually means you have a right to expect everyone always to be nice to you, different story.
The old gentleman's code was that a gentleman never unintentionally gives offense. And the idea was that sometimes you would, that you had to give offense.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So,
In terms of your definition of liberal science, I mean, the internet makes it possible for more people than ever to put their ideas out there and be criticized and participate in this debate, as you're defining. Does that mean that we're entering a golden age in terms of a society, truthfulness, because we have a tool now to foster that kind of liberal science?
Because of the internet?
Yeah.
Yes and no. It's certainly more open, and the amount of critical attention that any one idea can be exposed to on any given day is staggering now. This is what makes these systems so fantastically effective. All of these market exchange-based systems, they're able to mobilize resources around the world with astonishing speed. But no, in a sense that one of the things liberal science was very good at was identifying the best critics and rewarding them with prestige. So everyone can be out there in the debate, but Joe Schmo on the street and Stephen Hawking were not equally entitled to prestige in their views of particle physics. Some of those gatekeeper functions, which liberal science and the journal system actually did pretty well, I think. I wouldn't say they're threatened, but I do worry a bit that, remember, liberal science is rights-based but also responsibility-based. We've got to abide by the results, and when people are better critics and have better answers, we've got to find ways to recognize them for that. They're the ones who get the PhD and the Nobel Prize and that sort of thing. And to the extent it gets harder to reward people who are really good critics, really special critics, really brilliant, I'm a bit concerned about that. How does it come out? Don't ask me. I don't know.
You do see a lot of people rise to the top who in an older model might never have been noticed, right? I mean, people get attention for their ideas, and it's merited, don't you?
Yeah.
You don't think so?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, I don't think we know how this plays out, and in a sense, I'm not sure it matters, because as long as you keep the two critical rules in mind, no final say, no special authority, the technology is always going to change. But I think the trend for now, 300 years, 400 years, will continue, which is toward ever more openness and larger networks of mind getting involved. We haven't seen what's going to happen when you take the uneducated women of India, for example, or China or Africa, educate them and put them on this network. That's going to be, another billion minds? Many of them high-quality minds. The success of the liberal science system of mobilizing and engaging thought and minds on critical human problems is astounding. Just astounding, and it's only going to get more so, I think.
but how concerned are you that academia, at the same time that there are all these new forces out there, that academia itself seems to be becoming more constricted? I mean, not just the speech codes, but it's becoming more a kind of one.
Politically correct?
Well, and this political monoculture where there's free exchange there, but everyone thinks the same way. So you're not really getting it. Now there are ways that things are being tested outside academia, but do you worry about that, about this monoculture
sure.
on campus?
Sure, you always worry about a monoculture in an intellectual system. But again, there's this wonderful group in Philadelphia that has, I think Greg may disagree with me. I'd like to hear his answer to this, but I think things are better than they were 20 years ago when I wrote this book. And a reason for that is that the Frank Kamenys of campus have started to push back, and they've now found advocates who will speak for them, and they are now successfully challenging petty tyrants in bureaucracies on campus and making them think twice. And that was not the case 20 years ago when you had star chambers, completely one-sided proceedings, and terrorized faculties. What would be your view, Greg?
I can't actually speak to 1993 because FIRE was only founded in 1999, and I only joined in 2001. But I gotta tell you, I don't think I'll ever see a crazier year than 2007. 2007, that was the year that the student got in trouble for publicly reading Notre Dame versus the Klan, which is a case I talk a lot about in the book, just because the cover was found offensive. There was a professor at Brandeis who got in trouble because he explained where the epithet wetback came from, And just from explaining in the context of a Latin American studies class, he was found guilty of harassment. I mean, it was just case after case in 2007. So I don't know how bad it was in like maybe 1995. It looked like it was pretty bad. But in my experience, I will say that I think things have gotten somewhat better, partially because people know that there's consequences, partially due, frankly, to fire. But I had never seen things crazier than it was, I'd say, 5 years ago.
Is it a random walk?
That's really hard to tell. I think it's really closely associated with the expansion of bureaucracy. So Nadine Strawson, who, by the way, attended the Reason Cruise 2 years ago,
She didn't walk out of it the way she walked out of the fire dinner? Guess that was harder to leave.
She would talk about like why she was getting questions about hate speech codes even 20 years later, about like why people are still asking her about hate speech codes on college campuses, thinking this was an argument we'd fought and won. Because as the public, these were defeated in the courts of law. They were laughed at in the court of public opinion when politically correct speech codes came on the scene in the late 80s, early 90s. But they're still around. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of the philosophy and thoughtfulness that Jonathan talks about has gone out of it, but it's been picked up primarily by a less reflective, less thoughtful administrative class that kind of applies it with a certain kind of zombie-like mindlessness, which is how you end up with things like a case that we just filed suit in this week. A student literally was prevented. He was ordered to stop handing out constitutions on Constitution Day. And he got this all on tape, and it was a test. He wanted to see if they really would tell him to go to the free speech zone. And lo and behold, as Pope Pat put it, they obligingly beclowned themselves by coming out and saying, you actually have to go to the little free speech zone over there. So it's been taken over by a certain sort of like bureaucratic mindlessness that's making it, I think that some of the philosophy of it isn't doing particularly well, but I think some of the practice is just sort of trudging on.
Yeah, I think that's right. That I'm not nowhere near as close to it as Greg, but my perception is that the good news is that the ideological missionary zeal that once empowered, the sort of sense of righteousness that once empowered intellectuals to say, we've got to do something about all of this rampant speech out there, has really died down. And Jeremy Waldron's an example of that. His book is beautifully crafted. It's a narrow argument. It's an intelligent argument. The bad news is we've seen the bureaucratization sort of as a force of habit. It's kind of a background thrum in academic life. These rules that you've got to have discrimination codes which involve verbal harassment, and verbal harassment turns out to be speech that someone doesn't like.
I'll just mention a personal experience. About 8 years ago, I was undertaking some work and working with scientists on climate change. And for my work, I was named a climate denier. I was named one of many people who are engaging in an attempt, allegedly, to deny climate change in some sense. It was an intent. The intent there was to associate what we were doing with Holocaust denial. It was unambiguous as well, because there was also discussion among some of these people of a need to bring me and other alleged climate deniers to trial. They literally wanted to have Nuremberg trials for climate deniers. So, so there at least was there in some areas of science, at least there is definitely an attempt
inquisitions are, could I just say, as a general matter, not in the spirit of liberal science. But remember, the reason that people follow the rules of liberal science is not because we're all liberal, tolerant people at heart. Most of us are not. We're all mostly fundamentalists at heart. We're passionate people. We think we're right. The reason we follow these rules is because we have to. And the reason we have to is that we've created a liberal social order in which ultimately the way you get reputation and fame is by being proven right, by subjecting your views to the critical process. Some of what these people were trying to do, which is stigmatize you for getting to the wrong answer, is probably not legitimate. Some of it is legitimate because if you're in a minority, the majority will try to say, look, this guy's been disproven. This guy's like a flat earther. We know this isn't true. So part of that is legitimate. How do we solve that? The debate goes on. That's how. And if you're right, and if you have evidence, you do what Frank Kameny did, and what Galileo did, and what so many others have done, and you soldier on. The amazing thing about this system is that these people who try to throw up these smoke screens it usually doesn't work very well. Usually you get to the right answer. Now, some people have to suffer along the way. I keep coming back to Kameny. You know, I make him out as a hero. He died a poor man, and he never got another job after he was fired for that one. Now, it's not clear that he really wanted one. He became an activist, but he was unemployable for years. I mean, you have to have courage to fight for your ideas, and the system is not nice to you. Liberal science is not nice. It is not always fun, but it is amazingly effective and amazingly good at getting people like maybe Julian Morris riled up to fight back, push back, and argue back, and that's what's going to work, if you're right. So how many people here are under 30? A few of you. How many of you have some crazy dream to do something that seems completely impossible? A few of you. How many of you are instead going to law school? So, I'll pass on to you the best advice I ever got, which saved my life, which is don't go to law school unless you want to be a lawyer, because that's what you'll do if you graduate from law school. It's great to go to law school if you want to be a lawyer, but I became a journalist, and I developed the ideas for this book coming out of college, and you know, I was interested in history of science, but what really lit my fuse was the Salman Rushdie affair. For those of you who don't know, this was a novelist who offended the Ayatollah Kameny of Iran, who put a price on his head, and Rushdie went into hiding for many years. Many people were killed as a result, not Rushdie as it happened, thank goodness. And I decided that I had to write the ultimate book explaining why the Western defense of Salman Rushdie had fallen so short. I mean, it was so confused. It was like, well, you know, they are threatening him with death, and that's certainly not good, but then he did offend Muslims with this impious book, and you can't do that. I mean, you know, that's not good either. So at the end of the day, we've got to do a better blah, 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 blah. So this book began to take shape. It was initially going to be called Thomas's Disciples, after doubting Thomas was going to be a defense of doubt, and then it was called The Skeptical Society, and I quit my job to work on it. And, pardon me? Those are several of the names, Skeptical Society, and then I quit my job to work on it. I was working with a publisher that said they wanted to do it, and I finally got it in decent shape after throwing away 2 drafts, and the publisher looked at it and said, I'm sorry, this is still not publishable, and I can't lead you on anymore. This book is never going to happen. So we're pulling out. Good luck. So I dropped it in the wastebasket, because by that point I'd been at it for 2 years, and I was demoralized. And a great writer I know read it and said, you must not give up on this. You need to see this through. So I pulled it back out of the trash and did another draft, and by now it was actually pretty good. It was substantially like the book you now see. And it now had the title it now has. So with that in mind, I then took it to an agent, biggest agent in Washington, and not expecting much, was astonished when, like 2 days later, he calls back and he says, mind you, this is the big agent in Washington. He says, I don't think I can get you a lot of money for this book, but this is an extraordinary book. This will put you on the map intellectually. This needs to be published, and I can do that. So I was tasting success. 3 months later, he handed the book back to me and said, I'm really sorry, I couldn't even give this away. He said, I got one offer. No, he said, I got one nibble from Atlantic Monthly Press, ironically enough. And I said, give me an offer in the low four figures. John Tierney laughs. He's in the business. And he said they still wouldn't do it. So at that point, I really did decide I'd had it. You know, I was 3 years in on this book, and it was by then a really good book, and no one knew what to do with it, or even what it was. And, you know, Greg Lukianoff wasn't even born, so the audience hadn't even arisen. So I just finally said, well, better than nothing. I took it to my friend David Bose at the Cato Institute. You all know David, some of you, a great man. He's revising his own great book, Libertarianism, a primer, so watch for that. And I said, and he said, well, we like this. We'll bring it out as like a think tank book, you know, one of those little things think tanks do. And I said, well, that's great. That's better than nothing. I sold him the rights, lock, stock, and barrel for a few $1,000s, because that's how their business model worked. So you'll be interested to know that all I ever got for this book was that one check. We fixed that in the expanded edition. But then David said, you know, we co-publish sometimes with University of Chicago Press. Chicago is not only the world's biggest, but also the world's most important publisher in philosophy of science and history of ideas. They published Hayek. They published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn, and so forth. Popper. They liked it. They put it through peer review, which made it a better book. They published it as a Chicago book. It wound up being reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and now is going into it has never been out of print in 20 years, and it's now going into an expanded edition, and I expect it to be around in 20 more years. And what I tell people as a result of this is if you're under 30 and there's something you really want to do, then by God, you may be right. 35, if you don't have a mortgage and kids, you can probably pull it off.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Thank you. Thanks very much to Reason for sponsoring this. Thank you to Jonathan.
Thank you, Reason. Thank you, Fire.